If you don't know me, my name is David. I'm one of the pastors at Community Church, and I am the pastor here specifically at New City. We are trying a couple new things as our church is addressing conversations that sometimes the church doesn't have or doesn't know how to have. A couple months ago, we had a conversation on addiction and recovery and self-harm and suicide. And tonight, we're going to be having another really encouraging conversation, right? That is for real, though. It's an encouraging conversation. On race and reconciliation. And we get the reasoning for this, we get this out of the book of Jeremiah chapter 29, where God says to his people, like, seek the welfare of the place that I've sent you. Seek the peace and the justice and the holistic healing of the place that I have sent you. And I think that if we were honest and we look around, anytime we turn on the news or we hop on social media or Twitter or whatever, we can tell that there's something not quite right happening. And we see it probably more than ever now in this era of instant gratification and news. And so tonight, we just wanted to have an open conversation about things we might not know the most about and be able to ask questions. And so if you do have questions at any point during the night, we had some extra cards from a service a couple weeks ago in the back. Pastor Joe's got them, and there's pens back there. If you have a question, you want to write it down, drop it in the can. If it's a great question, we'll read it. If it's a crazy question, we won't, because we got to filter some of that crazy out, you know what I mean? No? Okay, good. But I just want to point out that the purpose for this is to be encouraging and to lift each other up and to educate each other on the realities of what's happening in the world. That's why we started a couple weeks ago or a month ago on addiction and recovery, because it's like a real world thing that our church is facing that we don't often talk about. And today, as we jump into this conversation on race and reconciliation, we want to start off today by just recognizing the reality of what's happening, and then talk a little bit about what our response as the church needs to be as we seek peace in the place that God has us. And that we would just ask that God would open our eyes and that God would soften our hearts and break down the walls that we have built up, the cultural walls we've built up, that give us sensitivities, like we think we know what's happening, even though we might not. And so today is going to be a day to learn and to encourage and to build each other up, and I am really glad that you're here. So I'm just going to pray, whether you like it or not. I'm going to pray as we get this thing started and just ask that God would be present with us. God, we believe that you're real and that you are the Prince of Peace, that there is no one who can stand against you, God, that you are a good, good Father, the maker of heaven and earth, and we believe that you are in the business of reconciliation, that you are in the business of righting wrongs, and that you are in the business of shalom, that you want your people to be like you and pursue peace in all places. And so, God, we just ask that you would open our eyes and soften our hearts to what is happening, to the realities that people are facing in the world today, so we might be agents of change as well. So, God, we are grateful that you are with us and that you are present with us. We ask that you would just give us eyes to see all that you want for us. It's in your name that we pray, and we all said, amen. All right, so real quick, you might be wondering, how are we doing this? So I've got a friend of a friend, and we became friends, and his name is Nick Hallmon, and he is ministering down in Chicago at a church in Chicago, and they still love the Packers, and so it's fine, but he doesn't. Do you like the Packers? Microphone. Come on. You have a right answer. You have a right answer. Yes, you have a right answer, and you have a wrong answer when I ask you these.
Well, I don't want to start off with a lie, so I am a Bears fan.
Oh, no. Oh, no.
I've lost. He's out. He's like no credibility whatsoever.
But you grew up in Wisconsin. How does that happen?
Yeah. So, well, my parents were both born in Chicago. So I guess I kind of grew up with my parents letting me know there was no wavering. My dad gave me an ultimatum around age 5. Literally, we came home like straight from church. He waited till church was over, so I guess that's good. It was freezing cold, and we were at the door, and he walks in the house, and he turns around. He goes, "Hey, son," and I'm like, "Oh, hey, Dad," and he's like. He says, "Who are you going to root for today?" The Bears are playing the Packers, and I told him the Bears. And he goes, "If you ever tell me anything different, I'm going to leave you outside in this weather." And I said, "I love you too. Can I come inside?" And So ever since then, it's more so a fear of just being left in the cold by my father.
There it is. Okay, perfect.
We can work through my daddy issues.
Yeah, we'll
later,
work on it.
though, you know.
So about a year ago, Rebecca and I, we went down and we visited the church that he's working with, and we were just so inspired by him and his story and his passion for education and reconciliation. And so when we started to have this idea of like, what if we had a real talk about it, my brain instantly went, we got to bring Nick up here because he's got a heart for it, and he's got a heart that comes from experience. And so so I guess why don't we just dig in a little bit. Nick, who are you? Give us a little bit about you other than being left out in the cold by your dad. And
Okay, my name's Nick Hallmon. Hi, good to meet you guys. First, I just want to start by saying I'm super glad to be here. Pastor David and Rebecca are absolutely amazing. Can we just give them a hand for being such incredible, incredible people? We were having a discussion earlier, and I think it's so funny how you can duplicate so many different things across cities. You can find another like really good job, and you can find another solid friend group, but to find like an actual church that is home and a place that like loves God and loves people, you really can't find that in every single place. So if you go here and you call this place home, know that you are in a place where like you are going to not only be a part of something amazing, but God is going to just make your life more and more and more and more amazing by being here. So I want to thank you guys for having me. But my name's Nick. I grew up in Racine, Wisconsin, like my boy right here. All right, I love it. I love it. Some of you guys are like, no, Racine, the worst place ever. So I grew up in Racine, went to UW La Crosse for a couple years, then I went to Milwaukee, graduated from there, moved down to Chicago. I lead the youth at a place called City Church Chicago. It's part of the Hillsong family. So if any of you guys have ever heard of Hillsong, or if any of you ever cried to the song Oceans, because I don't think you can listen to it and not cry. So that's basically
I have
where I'm
walked
from.
on water to that song.
Yeah, that might be blasphemy.
I have not. I have not done that.
I don't endorse that.
It was frozen. It was ice. But
That's similar.
okay.
But yeah, in terms of tonight, to be honest, I want to give you guys kind of the license to like feel uncomfortable. If you do, that's totally cool. It's uncomfortable to talk about these things sometimes. Ask questions. Like I know he said filter out the crazy questions, but any question you have, I think if there's a place you should be able to ask it, it should be church. I think people want to throw things on Facebook and throw things on signs on the street corner, but then they come to church and they don't feel like they can ask something genuine and honest and be loved right where they're at. But that's what we're called to as Christians. So whatever it is, like we should talk about it. If you want to just bring it up later, you're like, I don't want to ask this, you can ask me later. If anything I say offends you, you can't stand it, it's the worst thing ever, you can just email me at david.johnson@communitychurch.org with anything that you dislike. So yeah, I'm super pumped to be here. I just celebrated 1 year of marriage to this beautiful woman.
Come on.
Here in the front row. Catherine, hi. Love you. Oh yeah. So yeah, we've been married for a year and a couple days now. Praise the Lord. That was all him. So yeah, I'm just super pumped. Yeah.
All right, so let's just get right into it. Why are we talking about this? And is this like a social issue, a civil rights issue, or is this something bigger?
I think that can sometimes be the trap that we all get stuck into. We think when it comes to like race and race relations, we think it's totally like social or political, and we forget that it's actually a gospel issue, that God genuinely cares about this, that racial reconciliation is close to God's heart. And when you look at the walk of Jesus, and I know we're going to talk about a couple of things tonight, you'll see where Christ would, interject himself into culture where there was injustice and pretty much just be like, hey, this is not okay for this people group to be left out, or it's not okay for this person to not be allowed salvation, or it's not okay for this person to not have access to this. And you kind of see where Christ came and he broke away from what a lot of the laws were that people held dear, that they had kind of thought was, okay, this is essentially what Christianity is this book of laws and nothing else. And so I think it's truly a gospel issue, and it's something God cares about. But I think oftentimes in church, we don't talk about that, and sometimes we pigeonhole what God cares about to just a couple issues. Like, if you ask someone, what does God care about? They're like, oh, well, he cares about this, this, and this. well, does God care about this? No, 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 no. That's not, that's not on God's list of topics. But the reality is that all throughout Scripture we see where God talks about how we are made in His likeness and image. He talks about how we are all made to be able to live on one accord. How when we come to the body of Christ, all things are made equal. And so if we ever are in a society or a space where things are not equal, it's our job to not only be able to recognize it, but to make every effort possible to actually work towards changing and reconciling that.
So why do you think it's classically uncomfortable for, I don't know, I'm going to say this without coming across callous, but why is it uncomfortable for white people to talk about this?
Interesting question. So, and FYI, if sometimes we may be like black people, white people, we're not speaking for every person on the planet.
Totally.
I'm one of millions of black people in the world. You're one of millions of white people in the world. We're also both males, so we can't speak for the perspective of women. But I think oftentimes race is an uncomfortable conversation because people don't talk about it. I can honestly say I was talking about it at age 5 because pretty much most kids that are black or brown, you have a conversation the first time you realize that you're different. Because something happens and you kind of come home and you're like, Mommy, Daddy, this happened. And it's like, oh, well, we have to talk about this now. And so you have that conversation at a very early age. So for me, I'm not uncomfortable. I'll talk about it. And sometimes my wife is like, yo, Nick, chill. But I think it's one of those things where I'm not uncomfortable with it because I've talked about it my entire life. I've been fully aware of it my entire life. I think for some people, you either don't talk about it or you have kind of a blanket conversation of, well, everyone's equal, God is colorblind, and sometimes bad things happen, the end, So I think talking about the reality of it is super uncomfortable because it's something that we don't really know about, or that we haven't experienced or haven't talked about or haven't gotten used to talking about.
Yeah, so help us understand the reality. I know that's a broad question, but...
Super broad. No, I don't say that in a bad way.
Because help us create a foundation.
Yeah. So I guess I can start from, I think probably one of the greatest misconceptions that most of us have about even just the current times we're in is, and I don't think the media does the best job of communicating real news. Not saying it's all fake news, but I'm saying they don't do the best job of communicating real news. But what I can say is that oftentimes what we see is really just the awareness level being heightened of what is actually occurring. So I think sometimes we'll see things and go, well, it's only really ever been a couple instances of this, or I've only ever seen this once or twice. And I think what we are kind of neglecting is that we're just all seeing on a national stage something that has been happening or has been being seen or has been being felt by people for generations and generations and generations. So I think having this awareness of just the kind of inequality that's around is something that a lot of people, including myself, have always had. But I think now people are starting to go, whoa, is this a thing that's happening, or is it really just that we have cell phone cameras now, or what's going on? I think the reality is that you're starting to see things now that have always been there. It's just that now we're just way more aware of what's occurring.
Yeah. So what are some of those for I don't know, some people who don't always watch the news, or we cling to one channel or the other. What are some of those things that are now heightened awareness or?
Yeah. So I feel heightened awareness. Obviously, you have protests in the NFL is heightened awareness. I think you also have where you see relationships with law enforcement, heightened awareness. I think in general you just see anytime something happens, there seems to be some sort of response being had. And I think as a society, it really is just this point we're at where, okay, now we can actually talk about this. Because before it was kind of hard to talk about things because people would say, well, what evidence do you have? And you could come with stories and different facts or whatever, but there was nothing right in front of people's face. And I think sometimes we as humans, we just have this thing where unless something's right in front of my face, I'm not going to believe it's real, You can tell me gravity's here all day long, but if I'm walking on the ground floating and I'm not touching the ground, I don't believe you it's real. It's not until I touch the ground that I'm actually going to have a conversation with you about gravity.
Interesting. So, growing up in small town Midwestern Wisconsin, as a as a very Swedish, I want to point out I'm like 75% Swedish, okay?
Shout out to the Swedish people.
All the Swedes in the room, come on.
My man in the back.
Anyway, my man in the back.
Love that beard, by the way.
Nick, the beard is looking really sharp today. All right, so as a Scandinavian male growing up in the, like in the last 25 years-ish, as I was like growing up through elementary and middle and high school and stuff, like I think I grew up thinking like this just wasn't an issue. And I think it was because I didn't see it, right? And I had mostly like white friends, because that's pretty much who was living in our neighborhoods, right? And there were a few of people that weren't white, and I guess I never really thought much about it. I was just like, oh, cool, right? And so there were times where like now it seems like everything is just like boiling over to this response being like everything is racist now, and like everything is like at this frantic pace, when for me at least, I was like, until I moved to Minnesota and kind of saw some things, like I think I would have just been like, wait, this doesn't even seem like a big deal. And so we have these things like the NFL, and we have like protests and like Black Lives Matter and all these things. And so what is the purpose behind some of these like awarenesses, as you were saying?
So yeah, I think you made a good point. I think that, and I talk to people, and something people do frequently communicate is, man, it just seems like everything is racist. Like, I can't say anything, I don't get what's going on, I don't whatever. And I think what you're seeing where the sugarcoating of certain things is kind of being stripped away. So I think a lot of times people would kind of tiptoe around certain things that people would say or do and be like, well, that's just a little weird. Or, I mean, depending on your age, you've probably heard someone say they're from a different era. I would always get that from all my friends when I'd go to their house. They'd go, hey, excuse my grandparents, they're from a different era. And I'm like, oh, why can't you just say it? Like, just tell me, It was always this thing where, like, no one wanted to blatantly say, like, hey, excuse my grandparents, like, they're super racist, No one wants to say that because it's super uncomfortable. And you have to, like, think most of us, if you look in school, we're taught that racism is like a time period, and racism is an action that's occurring. So we think racism is like slavery or like Hitler, but we don't think racism is being like, you know what, those neighbors next door, I'm super concerned for our stuff now. Well, why? Well, I don't know, they just look like they might, be into some stuff. Oh, well, like, why do they look like that? And you start to probe. I think we learn that racism is just kind of this like either a period of time or just these like malicious kind of actions. And we don't learn that like all of us have an unconscious bias, that all of us have a bias towards something, all of us have a bias towards a people group. So I think for me, in terms of you just being like, what is the purpose of all this? A lot of this is just the awareness of things that have been there that for the longest time, there was no voice to it. I think when and I know a lot of us either, lived through it or went to school. In school, you learn about the civil rights movement, and you always learn about it in like this rosy kind of thing of like, man, Martin Luther King was great. Everybody loved what he was doing. He was revolutionary. And the reality is like he had like a 22% approval rating. People hated what he was doing. Most of the pastors told him, most of the other pastors in the churches he was around told him that everything he was doing was completely hurting his cause. All the sit-ins were illegal. It was going against all of these things. And we learned that, like, oh, this was a great way to go about this, but we don't really learn that at the time, no one liked it. At the time, people were uncomfortable. At the time, he was told he was divisive, anti-American, making a big deal out of nothing. He should just sit and pray. So I think these are things that there was no voice to a lot of those things, and now there's a voice to a lot of those things. Even in like, and I don't know how many you guys may see certain things. A lot of times you'll see like heavy celebration of like black culture. And sometimes it can be like, whoa, like the attention's really on like black people nowadays. And it's not that it's just about black people, but there is a celebration of a culture that often is not truly celebrated. A lot of the times you'll see there's a hashtag people use, like hashtag Black Love. And it'll be like of like happy like black couples. And a lot of the times you have that because you ask the average person what they think about like black couples, and they're like, well, mom's probably like doing this, dad's probably like not around. And there's this like stereotype of what we've been fed as culture, whether it's through TV, media, stories we've heard of what we think that, black culture is or black people are. And so I think there's kind of an onus on us to be like, hey, I know what you're being shown by the world. I know what's being pumped into you, but this is what it actually is. So sometimes we just kind of have to fight back against what is being portrayed about us in society. Because unfortunately, and we all know this, our society usually, lowers itself to the lowest common denominator, meaning whatever the most easily digestible version of people are is exactly what we see. Most of you guys in this room are probably Christians or have heard of God, or maybe you just stumbled into this thinking it was a bookstore. Sorry, we don't have any books to sell.
Just Bibles.
Just
No.
so good. But one of the things that probably upsets you is every Christian you see on TV is like the most lunatic, crazy Christian on the planet. They never put a Christian on the news. It's like, what do you think about this? Well, you know what I think? God really loved me when I was in my sin, so I'm going to love this person when they're in their sin, and I'm going to do everything I can to come alongside them. You never hear that. You hear, what? Here's what's going to happen. God's going to take them, tear their eyes out, put them in hell, take them out of hell, tear their arms off, put them back in hell, take them back out of hell, tear their legs off, put them in hell again, And it's like, oh, dude, what? Is that even in the Bible? Like, you're like, who is this guy? Where did they get him from? What church does he go to so I can never go there? But it's like, that's how our society works, is we love to digest stereotypes. It's super, super hard to look at someone that looks completely different than us, dresses different than us, talks than us, and go, okay, I'm going to extend myself and my heart and my best wishes and intentions and assumptions about you to you and engage this in that way. It's super hard for us to do just as humans in general. And then compounded upon that, we have a society that unfortunately has often reared us to believe the exact opposite about certain people groups.
Wow. So that would connect into some of the profiling and some of the more direct prejudice that we see, whether you've got a new neighbor that moved in and you're a little skeptical of, or whether you're, I don't know, like you're out driving at night, right? Can you speak to a little bit about what some people, people of color would experience when they are out that maybe we might not quite understand?
Yeah, I think I told you this story earlier. So when I was in Milwaukee, the roommates I lived with 5 guys. All of them are white. It's relevant to the story, that's why I'm telling you that. So I'm just like, oh yeah, I love a bunch of white guys. Please listen to me. See? No, I'm just kidding. But all of them are white. And there's a friend of mine who I had chemistry class with outside. He's completely hammered, and he was about to get in this fight with like 3 guys, right? So we hear him outside, and he's like just saying all these different words that I'm not gonna say, and he's like telling them all these different things. And I look at my friend, I'm like, yo, that's my boy. I've got to go help him. And they're like, well, there's like 3 guys. I was like, it's not a big deal. So basically, I run out there. It's getting out of hand. These guys are getting crazy. Like one guy's like, I've got a gun. I'm gonna blah 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 blah, whatever, all this kind of stuff. So my roommate panics and he like calls the cops because he's like, this is getting super serious. I'm trying to control my friend because he's hammered out of his mind all over the place. Cops end up showing up. The guy who's literally yelling, like, I'm going to, like, pull out a gun, as they're coming up, they're like, look at them and they're like, okay, you guys go home. So they just leave. Looks at my friend who's, like, super hammered, still cursing him off, like, flipping him off, like he's Stone Cold Steve Austin, like, doing all this stuff, tells him go home, and he grabs me, and he's like, all right, we need to talk to you. And I'm just like, what's going on? They're like, we need all your information. We need to know what it was you were starting out here, all this kind of stuff. So all my roommates run out. And they're like, whoa, 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 what's going on? He was breaking up the fight. And they were like, well, it just seemed like he was the one. And my one roommate, he's like, why do you say that? And I looked at him and I was like, yo, chill, man, because so like you don't understand. Like you guys are gonna go back. Like this is gonna be like just chill out. And then we got back inside the house, and I remember it was like, if any of you guys have in a relationship or ever been in a relationship and gotten in a horrible fight, and you still have to like go somewhere together or like drive home. There's that awkward silence of just like, weather tomorrow, whoa, and we really had that just a super awkward moment because for them, even though a lot of them had been friends with me for years, they had never seen it, For me, that was just a normal thing. Like I knew getting involved in that, there was a heavy chance that on first assumption alone, unfortunately, a lot of the times, no matter how I dress, talk, whatever, sometimes I'm going to be seen as the aggressor or the issue. And for them, it was the first time they had seen it, because for so much of their mind, and I remember it was this weird conversation. They were like, so was that? And I was like, yeah. And they were like, does that happen? I was like, a lot. And they were like, well, it doesn't make sense. And I was like, well, unfortunately, that's just kind of how society is. And I think sometimes we have this thing where, I think the heat falls directly on like officers in general, like they're evil, they're bad. That's not the case at all. The thing is that they're upholding laws inside of a society that has often taught us that people of color are inherently dangerous, inherently like going to hurt you, inherently way more like drastic, irrational, can't be reasoned with, all of this different stuff. And I think if you think about any movies or media or things you consume, even maybe your like initial perception of me, I can't tell you how many times people are like, oh wow, like you like speak so well. And I'm like, oh, like what does that mean? And they're like, well, you just speak really well. And I was like, well, did you expect me to not speak well? Like, I don't, and I think it's just like sometimes we have to challenge the perceptions that are ingrained in us and the assumptions that we have. And sometimes we don't even realize them. But for a long, long, long time, media, things we consume, TV, film, culture, has kind of reinforced kind of a singular narrative about people of color. And so oftentimes we have people that are, and not even just like officers, but the justice system, whatever, upholding the law, but working through their own bias and lens that has been ingrained in them.
So really, just being you, there's already this sense of just judgment from the world. Now, do you think that was unique to you, or is this something that is just, like, I know that this is probably asked all the time. So, I mean, this happens. Okay, this happened to you. Okay, so, but this can't be happening everywhere, right?
How many of you guys have heard of code switching? You have? Okay. Now, wait, actually, I'm going to ask that question. How many of you guys have heard of code switching? Now, I'm looking around the room. Okay? Most people haven't heard of code switching. Code switching is a thing that all black people know. Code switching is changing the way that you talk, the way you dress, and the way you act for different environments based on your success and acceptance in that environment. I can't tell you how many job interviews I've shown up for, where after I'm on the phone, I show up, I'm like, hi, I'm Nick. They're like, oh, you're Nick. Okay. And I'm like, well, what were you guys like expecting, Code switching is a thing that you just learn, and you've kind of become a pro at, because you know that in certain environments, you kind of have to do what you can to deflect a little bit of the judgment that you're going to get. Even something as silly as glasses. I can genuinely tell you, I get treated so differently. I haven't not worn glasses in a while because I like these glasses, and I'm a Chicago hipster. So I'm joking. Some of you guys are like, I know we've been judging you the whole time.
See, for them, all this judgment's coming because you're a hipster and has nothing to do with you being black. So it's like...
You got to edit that out of the podcast.
Edit it out.
No, I'm kidding. But no, so even in terms of like me wearing glasses or not, there's a difference in terms of how I'm treated and the assumption of my intellect, things like that. So I think that you just kind of learn early on how to maneuver and navigate certain situations. And it's so funny because my wife, there are certain situations we'll go into where she's like, why are you wearing that? And I'm like, well, it's just how I dress because it's so normal for me. And she's like, no, you're doing this because you feel you have to dress this way. And I was like, well, I kind of do. And sometimes she feels so uncomfortable because she's like, it's crazy. You have to like you have to overthink these things. But these are things that if I don't think about them, unfortunately, we've seen where the justification for certain things has always been, well, look how they were dressed, or look what they were wearing, and these certain things. And while changing your attire doesn't fully protect you, there is sometimes this feeling of, okay, if I dress a little different, talk a little different, maybe I'll experience it a little bit less.
So we all read and we all heard about civil rights movement in the 60s and all this progress and all the legislation that was made to like curb overt prejudice and oppression, and so we're quite a ways from there. Yeah. Have we progressed, or has it not worked?
It's a really good question. I think that you can pass a law, but laws don't change people's hearts. Yeah. Laws don't change people's minds. And I think what sometimes we do is we have laws passed and we neglect the genesis of those laws. So, for instance, my wife, doesn't look the same as me. We're different skin colors, and we've been married for over a year now, and that's been legal for, what is it, like 1966 or something like that. And there's people that have issues with it. There's people that are not okay with it. Now, someone would go, well, this is legal, so why does it matter what someone thinks or feels or whatever? But I think often we forget that the genesis of laws is in the heart of people. And the need for those laws wasn't just to reverse legislation in our society. It was to hopefully get to a point where people will now see this as like the new norm. But if you just go, okay, well, it's legal for that to happen, but I'm still not okay with that, and I'm not going to tell my kids it's okay, and they're not going to tell their kids it's okay, well, then this just kind of continues. And I think sometimes what's happened is we have laws that have passed, but because people's hearts haven't changed and because people's mindsets haven't changed, no matter how many laws you pass, it's not going to change the way people think and feel in society unless they have a radical encounter, honestly, with Jesus, is what truly changes people. But I do think building relationships outside of your circle is an absolutely huge thing. And I think, like, just to take it, like, way, way back, I know it's always awkward to talk about slavery, but, like, when you look at the kind of, like, the genesis and when, like, slavery occurred, like, even when this country was founded, like, people talk about, the Declaration of Independence, like, all men are created equal. Like, literally that at no point was like, okay, part B, eventually these people that are property are going to become full-blown humans. So I think that if we understand that there was, maybe never the intention or ever the expressed intention for this to be something that was completely rectified, and now all we're doing is like passing laws saying it's okay, but there's still people that, justified it then, and then we see how things get passed down. And I think that's the thing that we kind of neglect is like these things are passed down and passed down and passed down and passed down. So if I'm like, oh, well, it's cool that, they're free now, but I still feel this way about them, and I teach everyone who comes up under me that and say that to everyone I know, surround myself with people who think the same thing, and that continues, and that continues, and that continues. We find ourselves in situations where some of the preconceived mindsets and notions and thoughts that we have a genesis from a genuine feeling of like thinking that people are not on the same level as you. And I think it can be easily justified as, well, that's just how it is, or that's not bad. But when you really break down, where does this come from? Why do you think this? Where did you find this out at? You really kind of explore and go, wait a second, maybe I do have a bias, which all of us do. All of us have a bias. I have a bias, you have a bias. We all have a bias. And I think for us not to be aware of that is where we really find ourselves in trouble. Highest level of spiritual maturity is self-awareness. So if you want to be spiritually mature, you have to be self-aware.
So I'm just thinking about how just living, yes, that's a jackhammer above us. There's not a shooting range above us. They're fixing the ramp, church. They're fixing the ramp for us. So it makes me think a little bit how, like when I would go out, I would never have to really think about like being careful. Mm-hmm. I would never really have to think about how I present myself. If I got pulled over at night, I'd never really even have to think, it's not even on my brain. Because it's something that's so present in your life and in the lives of people that you know. I mean, isn't that just crazy stressful?
Yeah, I think it's weird because I don't process it as stressful. It's just, and if this is good or not, I don't know, it's just normal, And I think that's where race conversations really go off the rails, is a lot of the times we'll try to communicate things to people that are normal, and either people make it extreme or they completely like disbelieve it. And me and my wife, one of the first conversations we had about race, it was so funny, because we weren't even arguing ourselves. We were talking about the way people argue about it. And this is essentially what happens, is you'll have someone like, hey man, this happened to me, and this was like really frustrating because it was like super racist. And if anyone ever comes to you and tells you something that happened to them or that they experienced that was racist, like, first off, know that that's not the first time that they thought about coming to you, usually it's a process of like, should I tell them? But I don't want to ruin our friendship and make things awkward. I don't want them to think I'm Al Sharpton. Okay, I don't know what to do. Like, we go through like a whole thing before we actually like really are going to be like, okay, I'm going to talk to you about this, just because it's often met with like completely negative feedback. So it's like, hey, this happened. This was like crazy. This is how it made me feel and how it kind of affected me and blah, 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 blah. And then you have someone who's like, oh, well, just so you know, I don't think that. And it's like, no, okay, well, no one said you did. Like, I don't think I wouldn't tell you if I thought you were. What? This is like, we're having this conversation. And it becomes this like, kind of the defense of self of like, I'm not this, it's not that, blah, 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 blah. And someone just being like, this is not only like what's happening, but this has happened like multiple times. And this is the time that I've chosen to actually share this with you. And so I don't think it's, like, I don't, like, walk out of the door and be like, oh, man, I'm black, dude, what, you know? To be honest, like, I think I love it, like, being black is cool, you know? Just like being white is cool, you know? Like, you should love who you are. Because I generally believe God uniquely made us the way that we are for the purpose that we have. But I don't think that it's something that stress-wise compounds it to me, but I'm also, a fully grown adult, and I've processed it over years and developed coping strategies, some healthy, some not. I think for young people, it's super important to be able to process this with kids of all colors about, inequality that exists and things like that. Like, I can say I've had a markedly different experience with my friends whose parents talked to them about race at a young age than my friends who didn't. And not because we sit around and have like powwows and we march and things like that, but just because our relationship, our understanding, our experience, our processing is on a whole different level than someone where it's like, I don't even know how to talk to you about like a pretty, important part of my life, which isn't the worst thing necessarily, like it's my life's over, but it's an important part of my life that is something I'm passionate about and making better for my children.
Yeah, you said inequality a moment ago, and I'm wondering if you could help us understand the difference between equality and equity.
Okay.
So it gets passed around online. Could you just help us get it?
Yeah. So equality versus equity. Equality is the state of everything being equal. When it comes to equity, equity is the state of providing everyone what they need in order for things to be equal. So for instance, like, let's say I'm in a classroom with someone who has a learning disorder, and I don't have a learning disorder. Equality would be we get the same test and get the same amount of time on the test. But in terms of my equity would be we get maybe 2 different tests that are equally as difficult for us. That person needs extra time and any sort of help to actually like cater to the issue that they have, but it allows us to be in an equal space where both of us are being tested on our knowledge, both of us are actually like, being able to advance in an actual fair way. And I think sometimes we speak of equality like, well, there's an equal playing field, but it's not necessarily the case because everyone doesn't have an equal starting block.
Interesting. So how would that connect to, say, a Swedish Midwestern American in Oshkosh trying to get into college compared to an African American in Racine?
Yeah. So I think this is a good conversation because people often talk about, on like affirmative action, college, and jobs, and all these different things. I think something that we have to be aware of is, once again, understanding the heart behind these things. Any of those things is not in place as a permanent solution. It's so that our society gets to a point where diversity is the norm and there's no need for it anymore. I think, unfortunately, diversity is not normal. The church I go to in Chicago is super diverse. At least once a Sunday, someone makes a statement about it, like to someone I know in passing, like, it's like really diverse, And it's like weird. It's like, well, it's Chicago. We're a diverse city. The church should be diverse as well if this is where people gather. But it's not a normal thing. I remember for one of my friends' bachelor parties in Colorado, me and a group of my friends, like, we walked into this bar. We were drinking water. We walked into this. I love it. Like, it's great.
It's the church laugh.
Some of the more serious Christians were like, I really hope so.
Just water.
I don't know if he can be up there. I'm just kidding, guys. Thank you to all of you laughing. But no, we walked into this bar, and this guy literally looked at us. He's like, where are you guys from? I was like, and we're like, Wisconsin? He's like, I've just never seen this. You got some of everything in there. And I'm like, yeah, man, I guess, like, because we don't go around like, we don't go around like, yeah, we look like a college brochure, you know? We don't go around thinking, we're like, you know, like the model of like 2017 or whatever. It's just how our relationship is structured. But I think that's something that we have to understand, is that diversity is not a normal thing in our society. So sometimes there are pushes for diversity. There are pushes for recognition of positivity amongst cultures, and it can be super uncomfortable if like it's not your culture that is being like put up there. But I think you also have to ask yourself like two questions, like, okay, is my culture normally celebrated in the pantheon of society? And then number two, is this something that is not the normal for this culture in terms of what's being portrayed as like, as being portrayed as a norm? And so I think historically you can get into all sorts of stuff in terms of like redlining in real estate, where they were like, you know, historically like not letting people of color into certain neighborhoods, to, you know, home loans being like denied to people that had like amazing credit just because of their skin color, to like landlords that were well known for just like writing people's like skin color on applications and not allowing that. College the same way, jobs the same way. And I think one of the things that we sometimes don't know is the prevalence and normalcy of prejudice in our society. And we see it as like, oh, that was just a snippet. And I think it goes back to how we're educated. We learn about civil rights, and you see those couple signs of like the really angry people that are like, say like crazy stuff, like go home, and it has like words starting with N on it. You know, like it'll like, you'll see all this stuff and you're like, oh, okay, like those three people were really, really mad, but everyone else was okay. And it's like, unfortunately, that wasn't the case. And I think a lot of the times when we don't realize the prevalence of prejudice amidst the formation of a lot of the systems and structures we have, we don't realize how much we have to go against that tide, and how much we have to work against it. So oftentimes things are just put in place because it's like, this has been one way for a long time and you probably never noticed because it never affected you. But we have to go the other way, not to revert, but to go from things being not equal to things being equal.
Yeah, so you're saying during civil rights, even the church had a hard time with racial reconciliation.
Yeah. So I don't know if you guys have ever read Martin Luther King's. He was in jail in Birmingham, and he wrote, it's called A Letter from Birmingham Jail. Are you guys, am I familiar with that at all? Basically, it's a letter where in it, he kind of just pours out how frustrated he is with the fact that the majority of church leaders and like religious leaders, because Christian churches and Jewish organizations worked closely together, were completely against everything that he was doing. There's even a line in there where he says, like, I'm convinced that, you know, the greatest enemy to advancement of black people isn't like the Ku Klux Klan and isn't any sort of overt racism. It's someone who just kind of sits in the middle and says like, hey, you're doing a little too much. You should just pray. And that's the criticism he was getting, was he was being told that everything you're doing is hurting your cause. You shouldn't be boycotting the bus. You shouldn't be going to restaurants and sitting in. It makes you look bad. You're making a big deal out of nothing. You just need to pray and wait. And I think you hear a lot of these things again in society where people are like, it's not that big of a deal. It's an over-exaggeration. People are just like making a big deal out of nothing. They should just pray. If they really care, just pray. Don't do anything about it. And it was kind of this frustration of like, if this were you, you would not want that, you know? And I use this analogy. I feel like there's no adequate analogy, but the analogy of if you were to call me and the person you love most in the world is in the hospital and they're like brain dead, you know? And it's like, okay, this person is brain dead. There's a strong possibility they're not going to come back to life. They're going to pull the plug in 24 hours. We need to drive there. And I look at you and I go, oh, why? There's no point in going. You should just stay here and let's just pray for him. How would you feel? You'd be like, what? Are you kidding me? Like, this person I love most in the world. We need to get there right now. Because even if like what you're doing may seem frivolous, you're doing something and your heart's there. And I think oftentimes like that's how things go when it comes to, you know, race relations or the fight against injustice, whatever you want to call it. It's often this thing of like something needs to be done, and there's very much a passive tide that comes through of like, no, You don't need to, And sometimes it's, the passive is very aggressive as well. Just like, you're ridiculous. You're going against things. And so for Martin Luther King, like, that's probably my favorite piece of work, because I think it shows how, to us, praise the Lord, to us, he's painted as like this heroic figure that everyone loved in the time, but the reality is he didn't become a hero until he got shot. It wasn't until he died that people really, really were like, okay, like, this man did amazing, great things, because at that point, all you could remember was the accomplishments, and he wasn't being disruptive any longer.
Wow. So we are, again, farther and further down, but where is the progress we're at today?
Yeah, I think that I think one of the worst things we can do as a society, and especially as the church, is not recognize progress. I think Jesus teaches us to recognize progress. He teaches us to recognize progress amongst people. If any of you have ever, we're all walking on this journey towards salvation ourselves, in terms of like sanctification. And we're walking on this journey, and one of the things that we realize is that we aren't perfect, but we're chasing perfection, which sometimes is very frustrating and struggling, and a big struggle. But I think one of the hard things is to not recognize your progress. If any of you have ever dealt with anything in your life and you have someone close to you that knows about it, the worst thing in the world is to go, okay, I did this 5 times last week, or 4 times this week, and that person goes, but you're still doing it, blah, 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 and just reams on you, as opposed to actually being able to celebrate your progress. As humans, like, we have to always be able to celebrate progress. I think that's crucial. I think that's what Christ teaches us, is to celebrate, the progress of people as we move towards more of who God has called us to be. And so I think with this, there's a great celebration towards the progress that we've made, but I also think stating that we aren't there yet is not a bad thing. And I think sometimes it gets super uncomfortable to say that, hey, like, we actually aren't there yet. And to be honest, it's way harder the age that we're in, because there's not a tangible, like, single law. You look at the civil rights movement, and it was just civil rights. Like, we just want civil rights, not even equal rights. We just want civil rights, like rights as like human beings, and that was a very tangible thing. But even kind of, us being able to obtain that didn't solve everything. And I think now it's very much the stance of, okay, we have to change the surface and what's kind of like underneath our culture. So we're like, we need to change hearts and minds and societal norms. And we need to know why, when we watch movies and like the large black guy comes on screen and it's like everyone's terrified, and then he like break dances and has a squeaky voice, we're all like, oh, that was the greatest thing ever. It's like, well, why was that so funny? Like, what were we, and like, not that that's horrible to laugh at, but why are we so normalized to like, oh man, this guy's gonna like kill everybody in here, because that's so normal. And then we take that into our life, and that's normal. The people we meet, and that's normal. And then we get in our jobs, and that's normal, and that's normal, and that's normal, and that's normal. And so I really think that's kind of the thing that makes it so hard, is it's not this like blatant at the service, like, you just said that. It's very much like, hey, what you're saying, what you're doing, what you're thinking, like, let's examine where that comes from. And it's that super uncomfortable self-examination, self-awareness of, oh my gosh, like, this, I always heard someone say this in my family, and I always thought it was okay, but now I totally get why this is not at all correct. So I think that's kind of the difficulty of the progress that we're in, is that it's far less tangible, but it's also the hard work that needs to be done.
So I mean, we see the overt racism, like what happened in Charlottesville, and we're seeing things like that, but you're saying that the majority of the problem is now just kind of hidden under the surface in ways that are far more overt, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think Charlottesville is an issue, but I don't think Charlottesville is the main problem. We don't have the Third Reich running things, so I don't think that's necessarily the issue. I think the issue is that people who were involved in that march or strongly believe those things then go back into culture, and they say, do, think, and feel things that are often unchallenged or normalized. And I think that's the real problem, is that there's someone that can be in that march and they can go back to their family structure, and they can say some things, and while people in the, like, oh, you may talk about it afterwards, like, oh man, he's saying that crazy stuff again, no one ever challenged him.
Wow.
So all the little kids in that room are growing up hearing that, and they don't hear anyone challenge it. So they don't think it's wrong. They're like, well, that's not wrong to say. No one ever said.
Yeah,
No one
it's
ever
just
told me it
normal,
was
yeah.
wrong. It's just normal. It's just what he says. Or he goes to his job and he has a job where or he or she goes to a job and they have a job where they're in a position of power and influence, and they're a school teacher, and now there's like children's education in their hand, and people know, but no one says anything, you know. And I think that's kind of the age we're in now. Is my mic going now?
So tell me, it seems like it's still this massive issue that's almost like, how can we even make a dent? Like, what are we supposed to do about it?
Yeah, I think it can feel insurmountable. It can feel far away. I think like it can feel like it's not personal, like it's not that big of a deal. But I think the chief thing we can do is to build relationship outside of our personal sphere. I think that's super, super important, to build relationship outside of your personal sphere. I think there's books you can read, there's movies you can watch, and obviously every social media platform under the sun is going to have a ton of information for you, not always correct, but I think there's nothing like a personal relationship that you can have with someone. And I think building those relationships are things that then open up our hearts and our minds to those experiences. I think when we look at Jesus, probably the greatest thing about the ministry of Jesus is that when Jesus was operating, in his ministry on the earth, the number one thing Jesus could do is Jesus could relate to every single sin, because Jesus was fully human and he was fully God. And when he died on the cross, he actually took every single sin upon himself and died as that sin for us. And I think what we forget is like, Jesus could relate to every single sin. So when he encountered someone and they had a sin, he didn't look at that person and go, oh, your sin is so much different than mine. You need to fix that right away. I'm still a work in progress from grace. You need to fix it, though, right away. He was very much able to relate to that person exactly where they were at, understand what they were going through, and then actually walk through that with them. And I think that's, I think in our society, communication is a lost art form. And I think having true empathy is something that is so difficult for most of us to be able to garner, because we're so desensitized. I'm not anti-smartphone, anti-social media. If any of you follow me on Instagram, I probably annoy the heck out of you with how much I post. But I do think that it's super hard to be empathetic when we're bombarded with things. It's super hard to go, oh my gosh, I'm praying for everybody that's affected by this earthquake, when 10 minutes later, there's a hurricane notification that you get. And then you go, oh my gosh, I'm praying for all of these people. And then 10 minutes later, there's a flood notification that you get. So I think it's on us to learn to be more empathetic towards people and situations. And I think that's the start of it, is us being more empathetic to things and building those relationships.
So I'm hearing you say so Jesus, being both God and man, faced all these same challenges and yet showed us a better way out than caving into those pressures, yeah? And so as we're following Jesus, as we approach conflict and as we approach these situations, he has shown us just a better way to go. And he's shown us a better way to respond, one with kindness and compassion and peace. And I think so often what we see is people start to feel cornered, and they start to feel like all of a sudden this conflict happened, like you were saying, something happened to me, and the immediate reaction is, well, I'm not racist, right? And I think we see these things happening, and some light starts to shine. The reality of the world starts to shine into these people and into us as human beings, and we're like, I don't want to see that. I don't want to know that that's happening. I don't want to face the truth of that these people are actually going through things that are very difficult, people that are made in God's image, and I don't want to have to deal with it. And so I'm gonna stick my head back in the sand, and I'm gonna say that it never happened, because it's easier for me to not feel it, right? So what you're saying is when we see these things, how are we supposed to feel?
I feel like you should just feel the way that God would feel. I think that's how we should genuinely look at everything, and I think that's where we start to pray for a heart and a mind like Christ. You know, it talks about there comes a time where our desires are gone and we start to have the desires of Christ, and our hearts and our minds are attuned with heaven. And I think that's something that we have to have, is we have to have the heart that God has when we see things occur, when we see injustice, when we're around things that we're like, whoa, that is not okay. And I think that's where we have to draw the line in our own hearts and our own minds between like our culturalized version of Christianity and Christianity. And basically when I say that, I'm talking about like sometimes we take our cultural version of Christianity and we believe that that's like Christianity as a whole. So we go, okay, well, this is how I grew up. This is the church I grew up in. This is the way that we worship. This is the way that we talk. These are the things we talk about. These are the things we do. That's the totality of God. And anyone else who does anything different is completely off base. Thanks, man. Thanks. Can you guys hear me better now? Oh, yeah, beautiful. I love it. Can we give it up for my man?
Come on, Steven.
Thanks, bro. Appreciate you, man. You don't know how hard that is when it's like the awkward, okay, people shouldn't look at me, but I don't want to trip. I'm going to look forward. So I think that's where we have to draw the line between what we understand as like our preferred, comfortable, normal version of Christianity and what is actually Christianity. And I think you see Jesus navigate this all the time. And I think we often like to read like the New Testament and like look at the Pharisees like those guys were crazy, but we don't understand how many times we have the same mindset as the Pharisees. Like Jesus literally healed someone that couldn't walk, and the Pharisees were upset because he healed him on the wrong day. Like literally, there's a guy that couldn't walk. Jesus healed him. He's like, get up, walk. Boom. Place should have been going crazy. They were like, hey man, so like about that healing on the wrong day. And it's like, whoa, what's the important thing? Like your rules and your religious comfort of the day you're supposed to heal, or the fact that God worked a miracle and someone's life was changed? And I think you see that like everything he did, he broke the rules so many times. You know, that's eventually what got him killed, is he was breaking the rules and saying he was the Son of God. And they're like, there's no way. And so, you know, you look at it like he literally went to a well, spoke to not only a woman, but a Samaritan woman, and he interacted with her, stopped someone from getting stoned for their sins. Like, he did all of these things that were against the religious norms and cultural laws of the day, because people had gotten so comfortable in their cultural Christianity, their version of Christianity, that they had lost sight of what Christianity was truly about. They had lost sight of who God truly was. They had lost sight of what Christ called them to. And so I think for us, we always have to be kind of examining that. And I think it's very, very hard. And I think context of just our society, like us being Americans, we've had a division from day one. I think one of the more uncomfortable things to talk about or even think about is that pretty much all of the slave owners were Christians. And they were like vehement Christians, like believed fully in the Bible, held church services, read the Bible to their slaves, taught them about how their lineage as black people was the reason that they were in slavery. It was in the Old Testament. Like, this whole thing was supported fully by the Bible. Then you had the abolitionists that were also like, wait a second, we're Christians and we think this is vehemently wrong. So I think sometimes we think the whole like social, political Christian fight is like, we have the right, 2017 is the most contentious time in Christian church. We're on the different sides. And it's like, it's been that way since Jump Street. It's been that way since day one. You literally had people since the start of this country that were like, I'm a Christian, God says this is completely wrong. And others saying, I'm a Christian, God says this is completely like the law of the land. And so I think you had people that had to bend within their comfort, within their cultural Christianity and their belief of what God actually had for them to do. And so I think when you really understand like that's kind of where we come from, in terms of just like our version of Christianity and like what we spring out of those two things, you realize, number one, that we're not in such a unique time of history where there's like no hope. But I think you also realize that we always have to be checking kind of what we're thinking and why we're saying it's God. Oh, well, this is what God wants. Well, why do you think God wants that? It's because it makes you comfortable, or is it because what God actually loves and this is what God wants for us?
So sometimes it feels like there's an us and a them, like it's the I feel like it's always us and them somewhere, right? So we've got like we've got soldiers fighting for the country, and then we've got people kneeling during the anthem, and it's like there's like one party has to be right, and I think that's where people start to like have these interesting like ultimatums put on them, and the news reports whatever it wants to report, and they create stories to help sell headlines.
Yeah.
But how is it that, I mean, is there a middle ground between us and them? At what point do we rise and say this is injustice when it might challenge an authority or challenge a belief structure that would seem disrespectful maybe?
That's a really good question. I think when we talk about the middle ground is a place of understanding. I think there's not really a middle ground in terms of the sense of equality, like for just a a blanket thing, like should everyone have equal rights? Well, let's find the middle ground on that. I don't know, it's like it's kind of this thing where like, okay, certain things we shouldn't be finding a middle ground on, we should all be kind of on board with. But I do think we can have a middle ground in terms of understanding. Like I think that the NFL protests are a perfect thing. Like I think it's important to understand why there are people who like are completely offended by it and feel that it's disrespectful and all of those things. But I think it's also equally important to understand why something is a big enough deal that people are literally putting their jobs on the line and willing to lose everything that they have in terms of fame and success in a career just to be able to bring awareness to something that they feel is not only important to them but to everyone that they either know or have grown up with or they care about and their future children, and then do things on the back end like donate money and get involved in police reform and things like that. So I think it's important to have a middle ground in terms of understanding. You don't always have to be you don't always have to agree with the tactic or the method to agree with the message. And I think that's the issue sometimes we have is like people disagree with the method, so they disagree with the message completely. And I think we see that in church all the time. People are like, well, I don't like his preaching style, so God's not real. Wait, what? Like, that's like so extreme, But oftentimes you ask most people why they may not come to church, and the reason they don't come to church isn't because they have an issue with God, because they have an issue with a Christian, usually in their life. They're like, well, I don't go to church because I met one Christian once, and they were the worst. And it's like, oh, well then, but like, have you met God though? Have you encountered him? Because if you encounter him, I'm pretty sure you guys aren't going to have any problems, But I think that's the thing is like you let sometimes, the method or the uncomfortableness or the fact that it doesn't look the way you want it to look completely keep you away from it. And I think that's the thing where it's like, it's really easy to get messages completely distorted. And so I think in terms of middle ground, you can have a middle ground in terms of the understanding of like what is being done, why it's being done, how it's being done. But I do, for certain things, I don't think there's a middle ground in terms of, I mean, everyone's entitled to their opinion, but I don't think there's a middle ground in terms of this is right, this is wrong,
Totally.
For certain things, like I mentioned me and my wife, like no one's going to be like, hey man, can you find the middle ground on why I think interracial marriage is a sin? Bro, we're not going to find a middle ground there because like it's not, Sorry if everyone was like, oh wow, he said that. But you know what I mean? Like it's not. So I'm not going to be able to find a middle ground with you where I'm like, I can get why that's totally the worst thing in the world and God would be mad. But if you have an understanding of it, that's different from I can then maybe talk to you and like understand where you're coming from.
Sure.
But in terms of like the right, does that make sense? Does it make sense to you guys? Like
yeah.
In terms of like the right and wrong part? Yeah. So
cool. Man, I'm just taking it all, and we've been hanging out all afternoon, and I'm just taking it all in because it makes me just wonder, like, how do we not take things the wrong way? How do we not receive awareness as entitlement or awareness as complaining? You know what I mean? Like I hear that a lot on like, oh, there they go, they're millionaires and they're just complaining about this, again. So how do we understand what's true? Yeah,
I think that, and something I've even learned more of recently, through just having like talks with people or having people talk to me, I think that there's sometimes our understanding of someone's situation is that it's their situation and it's in their head. Like, there was some status someone had made, and there was some dialogue going back and forth, and it was healthy for a bit, but then it devolved like the majority of Facebook's discussions do, unfortunately. And there was something said in there that was super profound to me, where it was like, oh, I understand like the world that you live in, you know? And I was like, no, we live in the same world. It's just that you don't have to necessarily be aware of what I'm going through in the world, and you can completely ignore it. So I think that's the thing. Sometimes we think like, oh, that's like that person's world, or like that's how they feel. Or sometimes people think racism is like a feeling, like, oh, you feel that oh, I'm so sorry that like you feel that was racist. Like, oh, I don't think I didn't feel it. That was super racist, you know. So I think sometimes like that's the thing too, like our perception and understanding of it. And I think we do that with a lot of things. You know, you have people that someone can struggle. I know you guys talked about, you know, mental health and drug addiction, and someone can be like, oh, I'm sorry that you like feel that you're, you know, have to like do this drug, or that you feel, you know what I mean? And it's like, no, someone's going through a genuine battle and a genuine struggle, and for us to like categorize it as like it's just a feeling, or just like what they're thinking, or like it's on them or over there, I think that separates us from what God has called us to do, which is to go through the journey with people. Obviously, you can't journey with every single person in the room. Like, it's impossible for all of us to be like, oh man, I'm walking the journey with like all 60 of you. Like, we're there all the time. I'll talk to you every day. Blah blah blah. You know, that's impossible. But I do think that if God brings people to be in your circle, if He puts people on your heart, it is your responsibility as a Christian to genuinely extend yourself to them and walk through that journey with them. And so I think that's where we get things kind of, you know, mistaken. It's like, oh, well, they feel that that's that, or they think that's, and we kind of turn everything into opinion, and like we neglect the factual aspect of it. And when we neglect the fact, we don't leave any room for us to actually be in on the experience or understand it. We just kind of go, that's what they think, that's what they feel, and so then we judge them from afar of what they're thinking and feeling.
So what would you say then is our responsibility as the church, as people that want to care and want to help make peace and want to seek the welfare of the place God has us? Like, how do we actually do this? Because like I don't fix cars, and so I don't like think about regularly connecting with mechanics, you know what I mean? And so like when I'm out and we have like 94% of Oshkosh is white, and like are we like supposed to just go and find all the black people and like introduce ourselves, or how do we?
That's so awkward.
I know, right?
Hey, you're black. Wanted to talk to you about some black stuff. You got a few minutes. It's a questionnaire I want you to fill out. Check your race, please. No, but so to be honest, this is where the difficulty comes in, because this is an ever-evolving answer to that question.
Okay.
And the reason it's ever evolving is because God's going to call all of us to different things where we're at, and to different things in different seasons. So I think there's tons of things that you can do. You can choose to educate yourself more. You can choose to be more outspoken. You don't have to be the person that Facebook rants every other day, or does that. We just read a post the other day, one of my wife's friends was like, I don't always do this, and I don't like when people post this, and I don't mean to be the person that posts this, but, and then proceeds to be the person that posts it, which is the worst. Don't be that person. If you are, we love you. There's grace for you. God still loves you. I may not like you, but no, I'm just kidding. But I think there's tons of things that, you know, we can do. You can be more outspoken. I think all of us in this room probably have either a friend, a coworker, a relative at some point that we've heard say something that was like, yo, that's probably not like totally okay to say, and maybe we've never said anything about it. I think it starts with just, you don't have to be the like starting fights in your family, but if someone says something, just be like, hey, like, I'm like, why do you think that? You know, like that's one of the greatest questions you can ask someone to challenge them on their perception. And the goal isn't for you to be right. The goal isn't to prove them wrong. The goal isn't to make them embarrassed. The goal isn't to be like this, oh, I'm the Christian, blah, blah, blah. The goal is for their heart to get closer to the issue. The goal is for your heart to be more open, for you to be bringing people closer to Christ. That's always the goal. If you go into any conversation with, I'm like malicious intent or wanting to be right, it's failed from the go. Yeah. Even if you end up winning the conversation, which I don't think you really win conversations unless the person ends up, being at a point where they're more in love with God and you're more in love with God too. That's the only way we win, right? So I honestly think that. I think that's a huge thing all of us can do. Like I was saying, we can obviously educate ourselves more. I think there's ways you can get involved. There's organizations that you can give money to. There's places you can give time to. If there's nothing around here, you can be the one to start it. You have a church and you have a pastor who's literally willing to try anything under the sun. And I don't say that in a bad way. I say that in an amazing way because he's such a visionary and wants to reach the entire city. So if you're like, I have a heart for this, I feel like we don't have anything that speaks to this, then let's do something about it. And so I think that it's always kind of evolving. But I think the best thing you can do is you can look right where you're at, go, who's around me? Who am I around? Family, friends, workplace. Now, who around me am I able to influence in any sort of way? And then you go, where can I extend my influence to? And I think you always have to be kind of asking that to basically be a part, to be a part of the solution more. And it literally looks different for everybody. There's people that give millions of dollars to organizations. There's people that give hundreds of hours of time. There's people that, just in the middle of the day when their friends post a status, will text them and be like, hey, man, I just want to talk to you about your status real quick because I'm having a hard time understanding what you're saying. And then they call and they talk to that person. And it's I think we can't neglect the impact of changing one life. Because when we think about it, number one, that's what Christ has called us to, is to change the lives of those around us. But also we have to look at everything that we're living in now is also because people weren't making an effort to necessarily change the lives of those around them all the time. So it's kind of on us to be okay, let me change more lives, Let me have more influence in this area. Let me speak about this more. Let me learn more. And so I think the more that you want to do, and if you have a heart for it, God's going to reveal it to you. If you have a heart for it, God will put stuff on your heart. But it is hard, I think me and my wife, we constantly struggle with, I wish we could do more. And some people will see this and be like, oh, it's so cool you did this. And I'm like, I wish I could do more, But I think that's a good thing to always be I want to do more. Because I think the minute you get to doing everything perfectly, that's the space you never want to be there. It's like being yeah, man, got my sin under control, living a perfect life. Basically Jesus, that's the last place you want to be. So yeah, did that make sense? Yeah. Does that make sense? Okay.
Yeah, because I think we talk a lot here about glory, and we talk a lot about we were made for the purpose of showing the world who God is, and when we start to respond with prejudice and we start to respond with that the spirit of fear and of oppression and all of those things, that's the last thing that we're showing the world, right? And even when we're responding to conflict in ways that's combative or angry or whatever, I know there's righteous anger, but I just mean when with our purpose of showing the world who God is, one of the greatest ways we can do that is loving our neighbor, right? And when we're seeing someone attacked or slandered or any of that happening, it's our duty, it's our responsibility to come alongside the hurting, to come alongside the oppressed, to come alongside the marginalized, and not to immediately assume that they are who society says they might be. And so the church has such an amazing and beautiful opportunity to be able to show love and grace and peace, and to be on the forefront for justice, and not necessarily public disrespect, but rather the opposite of pointing people this observing world to hey, we are gonna behave like Jesus in these moments.
Yeah, I think we have to remember that every social revolution, the church was at the forefront of pretty much all of them. Wow. And I think that's something that we neglect, is the power of the church. I think the church often, it seems very powerless in today's society. It seems so powerless. It's well, we just go into four walls and we sing a couple songs, hear some advice, and then we leave. You know what I mean? That's kind of how we've boiled it down to. But it's only powerless because that's how we treat it. It's only powerless because that's what we believe is for it to be powerless. The church is the most powerful institution that there is, because there's no other place that can literally affect every single area of someone's life. You know, you can go to a doctor and you can deal with, like, you know, your physical health. You can go to a psychologist, deal with your mental health. You can go somewhere else and deal with your emotional health. But the church not only tackles your spiritual health, it tackles everything. And the church is literally the arms and feet of God in society, in our world. And so when you look at any culture, any society, anything that's good that's being advanced forward, usually somewhere in there, there's someone from the church that is being involved. And I think we have to not, like, downplay our role in changing society. We have to not downplay the power that we have as Christians to be able to change the world. And I think what we forget is that we're literally the only the only people that, like, have kind of this ability to show people who Christ is. And when we understand that, like, Jesus is apart from everything else, he's not just, you know, great advice, he's not just, you know, good teaching, he's literally the Son of God and the only true salvation that brings about permanent heart change amongst people, then we realize that what we're doing and what we're bringing and who we're being is something that literally will change lives and then change the world. And I think you can never neglect the impact of what one life can do. And I think that's something that we often completely neglect, but everyone who's changed the world, someone impacted them. Like, no one was just born like, boom, about to change the world out the womb, you know? Like, it took time. It took time for that person to be poured into and developed. Someone took a chance on them. Someone loved them. Someone forgave them. Someone empathized with them. Someone stood up for them. Someone advocated for them. Someone defended them. And I think that's what we always have to remember.
Awesome. Well, I'm just rolling it all around right now. So thank you for being so open and just willing to share. We've got about 10 minutes before we're calling it quits, and we'll let them keep jackhammering all night long. But I don't know, Pastor Joe, did anyone fill out any cards or no? Cool. Does anyone have any questions they just want to stand up and shout it out, or not? Maybe every question you've had has been
covered
answered.
Everything? There's no way.
Anyone? Anybody? Yeah.
I want to know, how do you feel about the destruction in Texas? What happened down there, and would you believe it was the culture's fault, or there's some misunderstanding about things down there?
You're referring to the church shooting, right? Yeah. Okay. I think that when evil shows its face, we have to look at it, and we have to be able to call it out for what it is. And I think that people can debate all day long about the politics of it, but I think when you look at that, you look at someone coming into a space where people are worshiping and taking their life. And I think that that's something that we as Christians should feel especially heavy about. But I think it's something that we as a nation have to go, okay, like, why is this happening? How is this happening? What can be done? I can tell you this, laws aren't the full answer to anything on the earth. Sure, maybe laws could change and they can help. That's for other people to decide. That aren't me, because I'm not a politician. But I can tell you that probably the most impactful large-scale crime that I've seen in the past couple of years was the church in Charleston. Like when Dylan Roof went into the church in Charleston and he killed 9 people in the church during a Bible study. And he was like, well, you know, he had all these, they found these manifestos about him being like a white supremacist and how much he hated black people. And he straight up said, I killed these people because they were black. Like, and I remember, and probably most of you may not have ever seen this because it wasn't really heavy on in rotation on the news, but there was the point where he was in custody, and the survivors of the Bible study and the relatives of those who were slain got a chance to speak directly to him. And every single person, without fail, said the same thing or a version of it. They were all like, hey, we want you to know God loves you. We want you to know that we forgive you, and we're praying for your soul. One person even was like, we would actually invite you to come back to Bible study again, because if you being there means that you found out who God was, and you encounter Jesus, then it's worth it that you actually got a chance to come. Every person who we forgive you and who we love you, we want you to know God loves you. We hope you know who God is. We want you to know that it's not too late. Just like, and I remember watching this and I was like bawling like a baby because it's probably the most powerful thing I've ever seen in my entire life. But I think when you see that, like, you have to look at our response. And I think you look at that and it's not like pacifism and it's not, a political thing. It's literally just like extending, like the love of Christ. It's like, okay, you've taken someone from me. You've taken someone from our community, but I'm looking at you and I know clearly that you're hurt. I know clearly that you're lost. I know clearly you're in a space where you need to know who God is. So my responsibility in this moment, I got two options. I can either toss a bunch of anger at you, which will make me feel better for like 20 minutes, and then I'm going to feel horrible, or I can extend the only thing that I know that can make this situation better and save your soul, which is who Jesus is.
Awesome. Yeah.
Yeah, so you were talking about like how we make laws, but then there's that period in between where hearts need to change and the culture needs to change.
Yeah.
How do we make that happen, or how can each of us individually like make that kind of change to people around us?
Yeah, such a good question. I think some of the things I mentioned earlier, but I think it's also like understanding the heart behind laws, and then understanding the heart behind why these laws were put in place, and then more importantly, understanding the heart of, the state of things prior to the law, because you can't really fight what you don't face. And I think sometimes we don't understand the heart of things prior to the law. We don't go, well, why was this illegal? Like, why weren't we able to use the same bathroom? Like, what is like the real nitty gritty, no filter, not like PC answer as to why we couldn't use the same bathroom? If we talk about that, then I go, man, that's what people think. And not everybody, but that's what a healthy amount of people thought in order to be okay for so long. So now it's like, okay, now we're like having those conversations. I think you can be completely ineffective if you talk about something too much, but I think you can also be completely ineffective if you don't talk about it at the right times. So I think it's just being able to feel out the right moments to talk about things. I think the world we live in, it's always the time to talk about something because something's always happening. Yeah. And I would not I get like blown up when something happens. People are like, hey man, what do you think about this? What do you think about that? What do you think about this? What do you think about that? And it's like, I have friends I haven't talked to in years, that are just like, hey man, like I just wanted to get, and I think that it's never a bad time to talk about something because something's always happening. But I think you always have to go in just genuinely going, I want to know what someone thinks about this. And I've asked people who I vehemently disagree with on things, like what they think about things. And I'll hear their response, and my immediate reaction is like, oh my gosh, how are you so, oh, okay, but, and then it's just that, but then it's like God working on my heart, God allowing me to grow in grace, God allowing me to grow in understanding. But I think that's where it is. I think you can't change everyone's hearts at the same time, but you can change the hearts of those who are around you, and you can like do a heart check on people around you too. I think sometimes we get that like surprise, like I call it surprise racism, where it's like, you what? I didn't know you were racist. And it's like you get so surprised, and it's like, well, you probably never like talked about anything, like, you know what I mean? You could have just sat down and been like, hey, do you think OJ did it? But like that was a good one. Some of you are like, yo, he did it. But you know what I mean? I think you can just have, I think once we get to a point as a society, and I think not just even race, but even like gender equality and like different things, like you see all this stuff with like Harvey Weinstein, all these things coming out. If people were talking about that more, there's a strong possibility it'd be a much different like society that we live in. So I think when we get to a point where we talk about those things as comfortably as we do like the weather and other things, we'll be at a point where it's not an issue. Because right now it's an issue because we don't talk about it. So we have a ton of ideas and thoughts locked in our head that we never share with our neighbor. And that's very detrimental because all I'm doing is reinforcing my own opinion and thoughts and views. And that is formulated or built from who knows where.
Wow. Cool. Yeah, Jenna.
You had a question about you? Oh, okay.
We're going to pump out 2 more questions.
Okay.
And then you guys can talk after.
Well, I think we have 3 more.
3 more? Okay, cool.
We have a man
I'll
in the
be
hat
fast.
in the back and a man over there, right?
Okay.
Cool.
Okay, so I'm curious. I know that the theme for the evening is race and reconciliation, But what is a loving way to ask someone about their experiences regarding their race and or ethnicity?
Yeah. I think it's something that you have to build relational equity with someone sometimes before you talk about that. I think it's very similar to, and I don't know what necessarily you guys preach entirely about, like telling people about Christ, but you have a higher chance of someone coming to church and building a relationship with God if you've gone to lunch with them once than if you come to them and say, hey man, do you know God? You don't want to go to hell? Come to church. It's much, and so I think you need to build relational equity. But that's the hard part that as humans, as Christians, whatever you want to call it, we don't like to do. It's I've got to build relational equity with you and you look so much different than me. Okay, well now we're going to build a relationship, be friends. And then we can have conversations because I'm willing to open up to you about my life because I know you actually care, because I know you're genuine. But if we're just going on fact-finding missions, and I'm not saying you're saying that at all, but that's what it can sometimes seem like. So I think it really is just building relationship. But I also think what I was saying, it is a good time to talk about things. If something comes up, you can just hit somebody up and be like, hey, I saw this and I just want to know what your thoughts are, on it. Some people might be offended, and that's their thing, but your heart's in the right place. One of the things I think we've all learned as Christians is that if our heart's in the right place, people will be offended no matter what, but if your heart's in the right place, that's literally where you always have to be kind of coming from. So does that answer your question?
Cool. Hey, Wendy, you had something real quick?
Just a quick question. I have an 8-year-old daughter, and as David said, it's a 94% white population here, so she basically lives in a bubble. Can you give us a good example on how to start that conversation on race with her?
Yeah. So I'll preface this by saying I do not have children, but I was a child at one point, and my parents did talk to me about it. And so I honestly think it's something where it's best, especially for kids, because kids notice things, they just don't say them. And I think that it's good to have conversations about things that maybe you notice that they may notice and just go, hey, what do you think about that? So I don't know how much she watches the news. I'm probably not a ton because the news is crazy, and I wouldn't let my kid watch the news until they're 45, which is the same age my daughter's going to get married whenever if I have one. We talked about this, babe. But I think it's good to sometimes expose them to things. So if there's movies or TV shows that they watch, and a lot of TV shows tackle a lot of things. Even if you go old school and show them Family Matters or something, you can show them an episode of Family Matters and just be this is an old show I used to love, and it's funny, family friendly, safe, and then that lets you spark a conversation right there. Hey, what do you think about that? Kids are thinking and processing so much that they never tell us, and they've already figured out certain things about how they feel and think about the world. A lot of the times it's just on us to ask them, but it has to be in the context of something. And there may be kids at her school that are saying things, or teachers that are saying things, and maybe she hasn't said anything, but I think it's a good idea to just bring something into the equation that is healthy and safe, and then have that conversation hey, what did you think about what we just watched or what we just saw or anything like that? And then from there, I guarantee she probably has some sort of opinion of, oh, well, I really think that shouldn't happen, or I'm confused, why did that happen? And then it kind of opens the door for you to have that conversation. But I honestly think examples are good, because then it gives you a sense of where they're already at with it, because whether they know it or not, especially at 8, she's already processed or seen something that has been related to that, in some shape, form, or fashion.
And if you guys need to take off, you guys can take off whenever, but we'll just do a couple more.
We got time? Okay. This is kind of a lighthearted question, but serious at the same time.
Yeah.
Has to deal with white Christians, men, encountering black Christian men.
Yeah.
In the evangelical world, it's not unusual for us to refer to each other as brothers.
Yep.
Hey, brother. I know in the secular world, a lot of black guys don't like white guys. You see where I'm going?
I see where you're going.
So when you encounter a white guy encounters a black Christian, there's always that. Is that acceptable?
Yeah. So I can't speak for everybody. I call everybody brother. I'm just hey, what's going on, brother? How you doing, brother? That's how I talk. So I can't give you a blanket statement. What I can tell you is that most of the time, as a black person, I can tell when it's like that awkward, like I'm really trying to relate to you, or like this is who I am, you know? So like if you come up to me and you go to shake my hand and you're like trying to, and I'm like, oh, okay, you don't do this much, do you, buddy? You know?
We have a handshake now, though.
That's
so
super awkward.
We're working on the handshake still.
That's like super awkward. Or if you're like, you say hi to everybody, like, hey buddy, hey buddy, hey buddy, hey brother, you know? Just don't, you know what I mean? Like, you can usually tell when it's like someone's trying real hard, and it's like, I get why you're trying, like, I appreciate the effort, but like, just be you. The reality is like, with anyone, being genuine comes across. So if you call everybody brother, man, call everybody brother. You know what I'm saying? Like, just be you. And if there's aspects of who you are that are like, quote unquote, offensive, then it's on the person who's offended to examine why you are that way, why you say what you say, and then uncover if it's truly an offense or not. You know what I mean? And I think that's what we all have to do is like, you need to be yourself, but if there's an aspect of you that's offensive, like someone can't just be like, yo man, you're racist, and like, oh, well, you aren't gonna tell me why? Like what? You know, you need to uncover like, okay, why is that? Like, because I believe that there's, you know, people can be racist because they're like malicious, but people can just be racist because they're ignorant. They don't know. A lot of people don't know. People really don't know, you know? And I think that like that's something that all of us can do better, you know, myself included even, of just like uncovering like, well, where's that from, you know?
Joe, did you have one more hanging out? No? Yeah, Dave, yeah. This is going to be the good last one.
Right, yeah, so I grew up in Detroit,
Yeah.
and I was a victim of racism and also racism in my family,
Yeah.
you know, and it stopped in my generation. And I just really want to know how we get out of that us versus them mentality, because
sure.
I hear like white privilege being thrown out
Yeah,
these
yeah, yeah.
days. And I see a lot of racism going the opposite way of what we're trying to get it to not do.
Yeah.
You know, we're trying to end it, but we're
For sure.
pushing it us versus them.
Yeah.
You know, so how do we get out of that?
Yeah,
You know?
for sure. That's a good question. I appreciate you having the courage to ask that too, by the way, because that could be perceived wrong by a lot of people. So I think that the biggest thing that, and the term white privilege, like, I think it's been completely like hijacked and used for all these sorts of crazy different things. And I think at the heart of what people are trying to say when they say it is really just that you have the ability to ignore the reality of racism most of the time, as opposed to other people that don't have the ability to ignore it. Like, that's kind of the heart of what it is. But I think with what you're saying, like, getting out of the us versus them mentality is something where I think it's hard, because there's the recognition of where things are or have been pitted as us versus them, and then there's the evolution from that place. And I think what happens is sometimes things happen and we get stuck in that this is how it is, this is how it's always gonna be, this is how it's always been, and we don't try to actively move forward. So I think for you, the biggest thing is, and especially, man, like, if you're the one like breaking that generational thing, like, bro, that's amazing. That's absolutely incredible. And that is nothing but a God thing. Like, God's obviously using you, and God is going to use you to do so much with that, because that's absolutely wonderful. And I think that in that, you have to be the one to constantly move forward and go, okay, like, this may be the reality today, but we need to look towards tomorrow, you know? And I think that's something that we constantly have to be doing. And I think sometimes in the acknowledgement of like today, we completely neglect today. And we go, well, that's not even a thing today, like, let's just get past it, as opposed to going, yeah, like, this is how it is today, and this is where it may have come from, but this is how we move into tomorrow. Because the reality is, the only reason that this is even the thing we're talking about is because we want it to be different in the future. Like, I don't want to be sitting with like my grandkids and being like, well, it's been the same way, you know? Like, I don't even want to sit with my kids and have to have I don't want to have the conversations with my kids my parents had to have with me. And I think if we have an attitude of towards that, of always wanting to push it forward, always wanting to move forward, always wanting to make things better, I think that that's crucial, because at the end of it has to be advancement. It can't just be the acknowledgement of reality. It has to be the advancement towards something better.
Awesome.
Does that answer your question? Okay, cool.
Nick is going to hang out. If you have more questions, that'd be awesome. I just want to be able to dismiss you on time. Thanks so much for coming out. Let's pray to leave, and then we can, then you can hang or you can take off, whatever. God, we thank you for tonight. We thank you for the truth of who you are, and that you don't want to leave us where we are. but that you want to lead us into a better way, a better promise, a better future that better represents you out in the world. And so, God, we just ask that you would let what we've heard and what we've learned and what we've seen, God, that would just affect us in a way that we could take that home, and that we'd let it change us slowly, slowly, slowly. That these would be seeds that slowly find the surface, and that we'd be able to make real change in our communities by asking the right questions and finding that shared understanding, and that we would be able to call things what they are when they need to be called out. But also really doing it from this place of peace and seeking first your kingdom in a situation. And so, God, we're grateful for tonight, and we just thank you so much, and we look forward to what you'll do next. It's in your name that we pray. And we all said, amen. Thanks so much for coming. Hang out, talk to Nick.